Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derek Dolling, Michigan Propane Gas Association Executive Director. Thank you all for being part of this and being interested in this very timely topic. Today, we're going to give you about 30 days worth of information in just 30 minutes.
My name is Jeff Vandermark. Some of the questions I've seen, how do you get started looking at infrastructure? It'll be easy on-site installation costs. Propane is very much available in the U.S. In fact, we're probably exporting more than we're using here in the United States.
When it comes to propane vehicles for at Roush Cleantech, what we do is we have a dedicated system. There's biofuel systems out there, but we just do propane only. We like doing that because you could really see the savings when you use just propane. And just to give you an example, with the price of fuel, I mean, 3 months ago, gasoline, it was pretty cheap. People really didn't pay too much attention to it, but boy, are they paying attention to it now. And if you look at what propane cost, auto gas in your vehicle, and let's just use a high figure for auto gas, $1.65 a gallon if you're locked in on a contract. Now, everybody I talk to, every fleet I ever go to, they always talk about, yeah, we have sustainability goals. We want to be clean. Nobody wants to pay extra for that. They want to save money. And propane is the only thing that I've seen so far that shows that to you.
We've had some great conversations here in the Midwest with FTA directors with the various DOTs. A couple of weeks ago, we met with the MDOT's FTA director, and I do want to just mention that their FTA money is now available for propane.
Basically, there are two categories of funding that we start with, and these are the two main types. But the really interesting funding is actually the competitive funding. For competitive programs, you send in a grant, and they have awardees each year. So Section B, the middle category here, is for bus facilities. And essentially, you can use these funds to purchase infrastructure for fueling, different kinds of buses, and it can be used to purchase any kind, including propane. But the really important one is actually Section C. This is the low-no emissions program. So in the past, this was used pretty exclusively for electric, but in recent years, they have been making this more open, and it's now used pretty often to purchase propane buses. That's been the case for a little while now. But what's new about this program is that just this year, they have made it so that if in the past you were awarded Section C and you chose to buy electric vehicles, but you're unhappy with them, they've now made it to where you can switch those funds that you were given over to propane. So you can now purchase propane vehicles with those funds instead of just electric.
So you're telling me that, Julian, that right now, if I have been awarded previous funds, I'm eligible to move those funds from an electric bus to a propane bus today.
Yeah, there's one important thing to mention with that. If the program is through MDOT, if you applied to it through US DOT, you're not able to transfer those funds. But if it is through MDOT, which is the majority of the programs, you are able to change it.
There was an overwhelming number of school districts that flooded in, especially in the Midwest, that flooded in comments that they do, they want that funding to go to propane buses. And there was not much support for the EVs. We've all heard that there's been some challenges with the EV buses, and of course the cost. That technology will be worked out at one point, but it's not there yet. So it's really cool to see that the larger fleets, in this case school buses, they're really coming out in support of it.
This would be the total cost of ownership. It's what you can expect over a 15-year life cycle. This is cost of ownership, but it's also showing you the return on investment. So if you're looking to create a fleet of 158 buses, this is the expenses that you can expect with that, going with the 4 different fuel types: propane, gasoline, diesel, and electric. Now, when you're going with propane, you will notice that the cost of the actual vehicle is a bit more expensive than gasoline and diesel. On average, about 20 grand more than a diesel vehicle if you're going with a propane vehicle. But where you're saving money and getting your return on investment is how much you are spending on fuel and for maintenance. Let's say that you want to make this size fleet, 158 vehicles. This is the additional cost you would be spending if you went with another fuel type that's not propane. So over the 15-year period, you'd be spending $2.6 million more with gasoline. You'd be spending $3.1 million more with diesel, and you'd be spending $32 million more with electric. Propane is a green fuel is recognized by the EPA to be a low emitting fossil fuel. So when you compare the actual greenhouse gas emissions that a fleet is emitting, propane is actually going to be the lowest compared to diesel and EV. This is our rebate application. So this is the MPGA auto gas rebate. If you are purchasing a propane vehicle this year, you're able to get up to $6,000 from our program. That is $3,000 per vehicle or vehicle converted.
Thank you very much for the information you did today. Thank you for taking your time out for a little bit with us today, and just appreciate all of you so much.